Are many, if not a majority of our churches unintentionally disobeying the Great Commission? That's a pretty heavy question that we will explore in this video, and it centers on one chapter of the Bible, Matthew 24. Now, before we begin this discussion, let's first mention the great enigma that this chapter represents. Matthew 24 describes events that happened during Daniel's 70th week, or as some like to call it, the tribulation. Therefore, if this chapter pertains to the church, then quite frankly, there is no pre-tribulation rapture. The church will endure that period. If, however, this chapter was only meant for unsaved Jews, well, this would be de facto evidence for a pre-tribulation rapture. A lot rides on the answer to this enigma. Now, as we discuss this question, it is important to point out that Matthew 24 is for the unsaved Jews as well. God doesn't prohibit the unsaved from learning from His Word. The question is it also for the church? And the Great Commission is surprisingly one of the pieces of evidence that will help us answer that question. This probably comes as a surprise to most, who view the Great Commission strictly in terms of evangelism. But it's more than that. Immediately prior to Jesus' ascension into heaven, He instructed all Christians on what they were to do in His absence. Most of us are or should be familiar with this passage. It provides us with 4 commands and a promise. The first command is to go. The literal Greek is, as you are going. As we are going, we are to make disciples. And we are to baptize them. And we are to teach them to obey everything Jesus commanded. Jesus then gave them and us a promise that He would be with His church until a specific event known as the end of the age. Now, the first 3 commands are well understood and preached from nearly every pulpit in the world. So we are only going to focus on the 4th command and the promise. It is this final instruction, teaching all that Jesus commanded, where the current church in America is deficient. All means everything, every chapter in the New Testament and every command. So in order to say a certain section of the New Testament isn't for Christians and only for unsaved Jews is to disobey the Great Commission, to not teach all that Jesus commanded, as there are 12 specific commands of Jesus in Matthew 24. And as if to reinforce this meaning, Jesus adds the promise that He will be with us to the end of the age. This phrase is from the parable of the wheat and the tares in Matthew 13. In that parable, Jesus told us the end of the age is the harvest, the separation of the righteous from the unrighteous, and at that time the unrighteous will be burned with fire. This is not a pre-tribulational event. Even the staunchest pre-tribulation scholars believe this happens near the end of the tribulation. And Jesus said He would be with His church up until this event. In fact, the Greek words translated always actually mean all the days. Jesus will be with His church all the days until the wicked are burned with fire. As we stated earlier, this precludes a pre-tribulation rapture, as Jesus is present with the church up until this point. So let's return to Matthew 24 and see how it's related to this term, the end of the age. Jesus' discussion in Matthew 24 is the result of a question the disciples asked. They wanted to know the sign of this specific event, the end of the age, and Jesus gave them the sign. As we see in Matthew 24:29, it is the darkening of the sun and moon and when the stars fall, just as we learn in Episode 2. Jesus told us this sign happens after the Great Tribulation. That is when the end of the age and the harvest occurs, and Jesus promised to be with His church up until that day. So the Great Commission and Matthew 24 are intimately linked. And the Great Commission gives us two powerful pieces of evidence that Matthew 24 is for the church. First, that Jesus will be with his church throughout the entirety of Matthew 24, all the days until the end of the age. And second, that we are to teach all of Jesus' special commands for that period of time in our churches. Wow! I am sure you see that this is earth-shaking information. But let's keep going, because there's even more. There is a specific group mentioned in Matthew 24, the elect, which means those that are chosen. Most pre-tribulationists claim this term refers to unsaved Jews because the Greek Old Testament uses this word to refer to Jews. However, in the New Testament, this word is never used to refer to unsaved Jews, and in all cases but two, it refers to Christians. In Matthew 24, the Greek word translated the elect is used 3 times. In verse 22, we see that the days of the Great Tribulation will be cut short for this group, the elect, and it will be cut short for them only. In verse 24, we see that the Antichrist and the false prophet will deceive unbelievers with great signs and miracles. He'll deceive everyone except the elect. And finally, in verse 31, the gathering together, which we now know is the rapture, is a gathering of these same elect. But let's look at this one verse in more detail. Notice that the Antichrist's deception is so great that he would have deceived even the elect, except that deceiving them is impossible. Now, is that what we believe about national Israel and the unsaved Jews? No! Nearly all Christians expect Jews to be deceived by the Antichrist. Many assume they will make a covenant with him as well. So the elect can't be unsaved Jews, can they? No, because Israel will be deceived. Additionally, there is amazing evidence that the early church believed the words, the elect in Matthew 24, were specifically to be understood to be the church. In the Didache, a first-century document, which is thought by most to be a collection of the sayings of the apostles, we find a quote from Matthew 24:31, probably the most important use of the elect in the New Testament. But notice the word used in the Didache for those gathered from the 4 winds is church. The compilers of the Didache did not use the word elect. It is obvious that the compilers of the Didache, or perhaps the apostles themselves, believed the elect were the church, and that these terms were interchangeable. From all this, we must conclude that the elect in Matthew 24 are the church. And if they are the church, then they are the ones gathered together or raptured, and that takes place after the Great Tribulation, as we learned in Episode 2. So what possible response is there to this overwhelming evidence? What could possibly support the assertion that Matthew 24 is only for unsaved Jews and cause us to disobey the Great Commission? When you hear it, you'll say, really? That's all? Pre-tribulation rapture enthusiasts claim that the mention of the Hebraic terms Sabbath and Judea in Matthew 24 is the proof that this chapter is only for the Jews. It hardly is. First, Judea is mentioned not because it's a Hebraic term, but because it's the epicenter of the Antichrist's Great Tribulation. He sits down in the temple at the abomination of desolation in Judea, today's West Bank, and it makes sense that those who are there should evacuate first. Second, both Sabbath and winter are mentioned because these are times when it would be difficult to evacuate. Travel is difficult in winter, and during the Sabbath, large numbers of observant Jews block the highways in and out of Jerusalem. If we were going to say that the terms Judea and Sabbath indicate that Matthew 24 is only for the Jews, We could just as easily say that the inclusion of winter and pregnancy would indicate that it is only for expectant mothers from Wisconsin. Both ideas are nonsense. Judea and Sabbath are mentioned for the same reason that Jesus might mention winter and pregnancy, for practical reasons. So, in conclusion, Jesus instructed us to teach his followers all that he commanded. In my opinion, that includes the commands found in Matthew 24. So, is a large portion of a church disobeying the Great Commission? And is Matthew 24 meant specifically for Christians? I believe the overwhelming evidence says yes to both. In the next episode, episode 7, we will examine the most definitive rapture proof of all. Be sure you check it out.